Missouri isn't one of America's largest states. It isn't one of the richest or fastest growing either. Yet somehow this state became the starting point for westward expansion, the center of one of the largest river systems on Earth, one of the most contested places in the Civil War, and home to a city that nearly became the most important city in America. It also sits on one of the continent's most dangerous earthquake zones. In 1811 and 1812, that earthquake zone was so active that parts of the Mississippi River appeared to flow backward. At first, those facts don't seem connected, but Missouri has a habit of appearing wherever major American systems overlap. Rivers in different regions of the country meet here. Trade routes and cultures connect here. And for more than 2 centuries, when people, goods, and ideas moved across the continent, there was a good chance they passed through Missouri. 25 facts, but they're all really pieces of the same story. Let's start with the rivers. Fact 1. America's real Main Street. Today, America's transportation network is easy to see. It's the interstate highways, railroads, airports, and ports that move people and goods around the country. 200 years ago, the most important transportation network wasn't a road network at all. It was a river system. The Mississippi and its tributaries drain about 40% of the continental United States. Rain that falls in Montana, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Colorado, and dozens of other states eventually makes its way through this network toward the Gulf. That mattered because moving things used to be expensive, really expensive. Before railroads and modern highways, transportation was often one of the biggest costs of doing business. Rivers changed that. A farmer could float crops downstream. A merchant could move goods hundreds of miles. Entire towns emerged because they happened to sit along useful waterways. And Missouri found itself in an unusually fortunate position. The Mississippi runs north and south. The Missouri River reaches deep into the Great Plains. The Ohio River connects much of the eastern United States. Together, those rivers link huge sections of this continent. Long before America stretched from coast to coast, Missouri was already sitting near one of North America's most important crossroads. And one of those rivers was longer than most people realize. Fact 2. The longest river isn't the Mississippi. Most Americans assume the Mississippi is the country's longest river. It isn't. The Missouri River is longer. From its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains to its meeting with the Mississippi near St. Louis, it stretches more than 2,300 miles. For generations, it served as one of the main routes into the interior of the continent. That didn't make it easy to navigate. The Missouri had a reputation for being unpredictable. Sandbars shifted, channels moved. A route that worked one year might not work the next. Steamboat captains learned quickly that local knowledge mattered. But despite the challenges, the river offered something incredibly valuable: access. It connected the Mississippi Valley to the Great Plains and eventually to the Rocky Mountains beyond. For traders, explorers, and settlers, that was hard to ignore, which helps explain why so many famous journeys started in Missouri. Before we get to those journeys, though, there's something else about Missouri that surprises people. It's one of the most earthquake-prone places east of the Rocky Mountains. Fact 3. The earthquake that moved a river. When people think about earthquakes, they usually think about California. Missouri rarely comes to mind. But in the winter of 1811 and 1812, a series of powerful earthquakes struck near the town of New Madrid in southeastern Missouri. They were among the strongest earthquakes in recorded American history. The shaking was felt across much of the eastern United States. Church bells reportedly rang hundreds of miles away. The ground cracked, forests collapsed, new lakes formed. And according to numerous accounts from the time, parts of the Mississippi River appeared to flow backward. That's one of those stories that sounds made up, a river flowing in reverse. The reality is a little more complicated. The earthquakes disrupted the river and surrounding landscape so dramatically that observers saw temporary surges and reversals in the flow. Even so, imagine witnessing something like that. You're standing on the banks of one of the world's great rivers, and suddenly it appears to be moving the wrong direction? The New Madrid seismic zone is still active today, which means one of America's most important river corridors also sits near one of its most significant geological hazards. Most of the time, though, Missouri's geography created opportunities rather than obstacles. No place benefited more from that geography than St. Louis. Fact 4. The city that sat in the middle. Pull up a map of North America and St. Louis almost jumps out at you. The city sits near the point where major river systems converge. From there, people and goods could move south toward New Orleans, north toward the upper Midwest, east through the Ohio Valley, or west toward the Great Plains. There aren't many places with that kind of access. As a result, St. Louis grew into one of the country's most important commercial centers. And if you were planning to head west in the early 19th century, there was a good chance you'd pass through St. Louis first. You could buy supplies, hire guides, gather information, and meet people who had made the trip before. In a lot of ways, St. Louis functioned as the country's front door to the west, which helps explain why some of the most famous expeditions in American history started nearby. Fact 5. The Cave State. Missouri contains more than 8,000 known caves. Only a handful of states have more. If you've spent much time in Missouri, that probably doesn't sound surprising. Caves seem to show up everywhere. The reason comes down to geology. Much of the state sits atop limestone. Over millions of years, groundwater slowly dissolved portions of that limestone and carved out enormous underground networks. The result is a second landscape beneath the one people normally see. Some caves are small, others stretch for miles. Some contain underground streams, while others are large enough to attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. People have used these spaces for tourism, storage, research, and industry. In fact, one of Missouri's strangest modern industries exists because caves stay naturally cool year-round. We'll come back to that later. For now, it's enough to know that some of Missouri's most interesting geography isn't visible from the surface. Fact 6. Lewis and Clark's last civilization. Lewis and Clark didn't leave from the edge of the wilderness. That's how most people picture the expedition, but it isn't really what happened. Before heading west, they spent months preparing near St. Louis. They gathered supplies, recruited men, repaired equipment, and tried to learn as much as they could about the territory ahead. The expedition officially departed in 1804 from Camp Du Bois, just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. At the time, St. Louis was one of the last places where you could reliably find the things an expedition needed. That sounds like a small detail, but it helps explain why the city keeps showing up in these stories. If you wanted to go west, St. Louis was often where the planning happened. Beyond that point, the maps became less reliable, the settlements became smaller, the uncertainty increased dramatically. Over the next 2 years, Lewis and Clark traveled thousands of miles through territory that most Americans knew very little about. When they returned, they brought back maps, scientific observations, and information about a huge portion of the continent. The expedition became one of the most famous journeys in American history. It also helped establish a pattern. Lewis and Clark weren't the only people who would leave Missouri looking for opportunity. Hundreds of thousands would eventually follow. Fact 7. Why every trail seemed to start here. For much of the 19th century, Missouri functioned as America's departure lounge. If that sounds like an odd description, think about what happened here. People heading west often stopped in Missouri to buy supplies, organize wagon trains, hire guides, and prepare for the journey ahead. The Santa Fe Trail began near Independence. Major migration routes connected to the Oregon Trail and California Trail passed through the same region. For many travelers, Missouri was the last chance to prepare before heading into unfamiliar territory. Imagine setting off for Oregon in the 1840s. The trip would take months. You'd cross plains, rivers, mountains, and territory you'd never seen before. You wouldn't be ordering replacement parts online if something broke. You'd want to make sure you had everything before leaving. That's one reason towns along Missouri's western edge became so important. They served as staging grounds for one of the largest migrations in American history. People arrived from the east, then continued west, and as more people moved across the continent, they all ran into the same problem. Communication was slow. Fact 8. Mail faster than the nation could move. In 1860, the Pony Express promised something that sounded almost impossible. Mail delivered from Missouri to California in about 10 days. Today, 10 days doesn't sound particularly fast. In 1860, it was remarkable. The route stretched nearly 2,000 miles across plains, deserts, and mountains. Riders carried mail in specially designed saddlebags and exchanged horses at stations scattered along the route. One rider would cover a section of the trail before handing the mail to the next, then the next, and the next. The system worked surprisingly well. The problem was that technology was moving even faster. The Pony Express lasted only 18 months before the telegraph made it obsolete. Still, it became one of the most famous institutions in the history of the American West, partly because of the riders, partly because of the speed, but mostly because it captured a moment when the United States was trying to connect a continent. Missouri happened to sit near the center of that effort. Fact 9. Mark Twain's Mississippi. Before Missouri became associated with wagon trains and westward migration, it was associated with riverboats. The Mississippi River was one of the busiest transportation corridors in North America during the 19th century. People and goods traveled on it. Entire local economies depended on it. Few people captured that world better than Samuel Clemens. Most of us know him by his pen name, Mark Twain. Twain grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, a river town along the Mississippi. Many of his most famous stories were inspired by life there. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, the world of steamboats, river pilots, and small-town life along the river. In fact, Twain's pen name came from river terminology. Mark Twain referred to a water depth of 2 fathoms, which was considered safe for navigation. That's a pretty specific thing to name yourself after, but it tells you how important the river was. River knowledge had real value. A skilled pilot could guide a boat through constantly changing conditions. A bad decision could end a voyage very quickly. For a time, towns like Hannibal sat near the center of American commerce. Then railroads began shifting the balance. And one Missouri city seemed poised to benefit more than almost any other. Fact 10. The arch points to a story. Millions of people have visited the Gateway Arch. Most know it as a symbol of westward expansion, and that's certainly part of the story. But the arch also tells us something about St. Louis itself. For much of the 19th century, St. Louis was one of the most strategically located cities in the country. Explorers left from there, trails began nearby, river trade flowed through here. The city became so closely associated with westward movement that it earned a nickname, the Gateway to the West. The arch was built to commemorate that role. Not a single expedition or event, but an era when St. Louis stood at the center of some of the most important movements in American history. The surprising part is that St. Louis nearly became something even bigger. For a time, it looked like it might become the dominant city of the American interior. And if a few things had gone differently, Chicago might not be the city we're talking about today. Fact 11. St. Louis almost became Chicago. Today, if you asked someone to name the most important city in the American Midwest, they'd probably say Chicago. 150 years ago, that answer wasn't nearly as obvious. In the mid-1800s, St. Louis looked like it had a real chance to become the dominant city of the American interior. The city's location gave it enormous advantages because it sat at the center of major river networks, so trade and people flowed through it, which is why businesses clustered around it. By 1870, St. Louis was one of the largest cities in the country. Then, the transportation system changed. For most of the 19th century, rivers had been one of America's great commercial highways, but railroads were becoming increasingly important, and Chicago happened to be better positioned for the emerging rail network connecting the East and the growing Midwest. So, investment flowed north, population flowed north, and Chicago gradually pulled ahead. It's one of those moments that reminds you history isn't inevitable. St. Louis didn't fail. Chicago simply benefited more from a new technology. Had transportation evolved a little differently, there's at least a chance we'd be talking about St. Louis the way we talk about Chicago today. Still, there was a moment when St. Louis wanted to show the world exactly what it had become. And in 1904, it got that opportunity. Fact 12. The biggest party America ever threw. In 1904, St. Louis hosted the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Most people know it as the 1904 World's Fair. Calling it a fair makes it sound smaller than it really was. The event covered more than 1,200 acres and attracted nearly 20 million visitors. For perspective, the entire population of the United States was only about 76 million at the time. For several months, St. Louis became one of the focal points of the world. Countries built elaborate pavilions. Inventors demonstrated new technologies. Visitors arrived from across the United States and around the globe. The fair celebrated the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, but it was also something else. It was St. Louis making a statement. The city had become wealthy, influential, and internationally connected, enough to host one of the largest events on Earth. And for a while, it worked. If you were paying attention to global events in 1904, St. Louis was difficult to ignore. Oddly enough, the World's Fair wasn't even the city's only major event that year. Fact 13. The Olympics nobody remembers. The 1904 Summer Olympics were also held in St. Louis. Most Americans have no idea, partly because the games were overshadowed by the much larger World's Fair happening at the same time. The Olympics were still a relatively new event. This was only the third modern Olympiad, and the entire thing felt very different from what we'd recognize today. In fact, some events were downright bizarre. The marathon became particularly infamous. The race was run in extreme heat on dusty roads. Several runners became seriously ill. One competitor reportedly rode in a car for part of the course before rejoining the race. Another stopped to eat fruit from an orchard. The eventual winner was given strychnine during the race, which was legal at the time and apparently considered a performance enhancer. Early Olympic history was strange, really strange, but the fact that St. Louis hosted both the Olympics and the World's Fair in the same year tells you something very important about the city. At the beginning of the 20th century, St. Louis was still one of the most significant cities in the country, and one of its most famous companies was just getting started. Fact 14. The King of Beer. Anheuser-Busch began brewing beer in St. Louis in the 19th century. That wasn't an accident. Brewing requires ingredients, transportation, and access to customers. St. Louis offered all three. The surrounding region provided agricultural products, the rivers provided transportation, and the growing city provided a large market. As railroads expanded, breweries could distribute their products far beyond Missouri. That's one reason Anheuser-Busch grew into one of the largest brewing companies in the world. There's another Missouri connection hiding in this story. Before refrigeration became common, keeping beer cold wasn't easy. Brewers often relied on caves and underground storage areas because temperatures remained relatively stable underground. Which brings us back to Missouri's geology. Those cave systems weren't just tourist attractions. They ended up influencing industries in ways most people would never think about. And nowhere is Missouri's tendency to repurpose things more obvious than one of the strangest attractions in America. Fact 15. The museum built from a junkyard. The City Museum in St. Louis is one of those places that's difficult to explain until you've seen it. It's called a museum, but that's not what makes it famous. What makes it famous are the tunnels, slides, bridges, climbing structures, and sculptures built from reclaimed industrial materials. The museum was created by artist Bob Cassilly, who transformed a former shoe factory into something that feels part playground, part art installation, and part engineering experiment. Visitors can crawl through tunnels, climb through aircraft fuselages, and explore artificial caves, then spend several hours wondering how any of this got approved. The whole place feels slightly impossible, which is probably why people love it. In a strange way, though, it also feels very Missouri. A lot of the state's history is about taking existing infrastructure, geography, and transportation networks and finding new uses for them. The City Museum just does it more literally than most. And while St. Louis gets much of the attention, it isn't the only Missouri story. To understand the rest of the state, we need to leave the big cities behind, because Missouri contains several very different versions of America. Fact 16. Missouri is 3 different Americas. One of the strange things about Missouri is that people often have completely different ideas about what the state is. Ask someone from Kansas City. Ask someone from St. Louis. Ask someone from the Ozarks. You might get 3 very different answers. And that's because Missouri sits at the intersection of several different regions of the United States. Part of it feels Midwestern, part of it feels Southern, and part feels Western. You can actually see this in the state's history. The northern portion of Missouri was settled largely by migrants moving west from states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The southern portion attracted many settlers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Those groups brought different traditions, different economic systems, and often different political views, which helps explain why Missouri has spent much of its history feeling like it belongs to several different places at once. That can create tension, but it also makes the state fascinating. Missouri isn't easy to categorize, and that becomes especially obvious once you leave the major cities. Fact 17. The Ozarks aren't what most people think. When most people hear the word Ozarks, they often picture a remote mountain region. The reality is a little more interesting. The Ozarks aren't actually mountains in the traditional sense. They're a heavily eroded plateau. Millions of years ago, this region sat much higher than the surrounding landscape. Over time, rivers and streams carved deep valleys into it, creating the rugged terrain we see today. The result is a landscape that feels far more mountainous than it technically is. And geography has a way of shaping culture. For much of American history, the Ozarks were relatively isolated compared to surrounding regions. Travel was harder. Settlements were more dispersed. Local traditions had room to develop independently. That's one reason the Ozarks developed such a distinct identity. It's also one reason the region still feels different from the rest of Missouri. You don't have to drive very far to notice the change, which raises an interesting question. If Missouri contains several different cultural regions, what exactly holds the state together? Fact 18. Kansas City and St. Louis might as well be different states. Missourians have been arguing about Kansas City and St. Louis for a very long time, and the rivalry makes sense. The 2 cities developed under very different circumstances. St. Louis grew because of rivers. Kansas City grew because of railroads and cattle. St. Louis looks east toward the Mississippi. Kansas City looks west toward the Great Plains. Even the culture feels different. The accents, sports rivalries, and local foods are all different. And if you ask residents which city is better, you'll probably get a very confident answer. What's interesting is that both cities tell part of Missouri's story. St. Louis reflects the state's river heritage. Kansas City reflects its role as a gateway to the plains in the west. Together, they illustrate something we've already seen several times in this video. Missouri keeps finding itself where different systems meet. Sometimes those systems are rivers, sometimes they're cultures, sometimes they're entire regions of the country, and that overlap can produce some surprisingly strange outcomes. Fact 19. The government cheese cave. At one point, Missouri became home to hundreds of millions of pounds of government-owned cheese. That sounds like a joke. It isn't. In the 1970s and 80s, federal agricultural policies contributed to enormous surpluses of dairy products. The government ended up purchasing large quantities of cheese and storing it around the country. Some of it wound up in underground facilities near Springfield, Missouri, which turns out to be a pretty good place to store cheese. Remember all those caves and underground spaces we talked about earlier? They maintain relatively stable temperatures year-round. That's useful if you're trying to store large quantities of food. The famous government cheese story involved many locations, but Missouri's underground geography made it particularly well suited for storage. It's one of those facts that's funny at first, then you realize it somehow circles back to geology, which seems to happen a lot in this state. And it brings us to a broader pattern that's been hiding in plain sight throughout this entire video. Fact 20. The fact that connects almost everything. Think about the stories we've covered so far. The Mississippi River, the Missouri River, Lewis and Clark, the Oregon Trail, the Pony Express, St. Louis and Kansas City, even the Civil War, which we'll get to in a moment. At first glance, they seem like completely different stories, but most of them share the same underlying explanation. Missouri sits where major systems meet: river systems, transportation systems, cultural regions, and migration routes. That doesn't guarantee success. Plenty of places sit at crossroads and never become important, but it creates opportunities. And Missouri has spent more than 2 centuries taking advantage of them. The result is a state that keeps showing up in American history, often for reasons that seem unrelated until you look at a map. And nowhere was that more obvious than during the Civil War, because Missouri wasn't just geographically divided, it was politically divided too. Fact 21. Missouri was northern and southern. By the middle of the 19th century, Missouri had developed a bit of an identity problem. Or maybe an identity advantage, depending on how you look at it. Part of the state had been settled by people moving west from places like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Other parts were settled by migrants from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Those groups brought different traditions, different economic systems, and often different views about the future of the country. Which meant Missouri never fit neatly into a single category. Was it northern, southern, midwestern? The answer depended on where you were standing. Most of the time, that complexity simply made Missouri interesting. As tensions over slavery grew, though, it became a serious problem. Because Missouri found itself sitting directly on one of the biggest fault lines in American politics. Fact 22. The Civil War started early here. When most people think about the Civil War, they think about 1861. In Missouri and neighboring Kansas, violence started earlier, much earlier. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers to decide for themselves whether Kansas would permit slavery. That decision triggered a rush of people into the territory. Some arrived hoping to make Kansas a free state. Others arrived hoping to make it a slave state. Before long, elections were disputed, towns were raided, and political disagreements turned violent. The period became known as Bleeding Kansas, and Missouri was deeply involved. The conflict wasn't really about Kansas alone. It was about the future balance of power in the United States. People understood that at the time, which is why emotions ran so high. In a lot of ways, Bleeding Kansas was a preview of the larger conflict that would soon engulf the entire country. And nowhere was that conflict more personal than along the Missouri-Kansas border. Fact 23. Jesse James was a Civil War story. Most people know Jesse James as an outlaw, bank robber, train robber, folk hero, depending on who you ask. But his story really begins with the Civil War. Missouri experienced some of the most intense guerrilla fighting of the entire conflict. Unlike the massive battles most people associate with the war, this fighting often happened between neighbors, sometimes former friends, or even family members. Raids, ambushes, and reprisals became common. The violence left deep scars that lasted long after the war ended. Jesse James grew up in that environment. He fought alongside Confederate guerrillas as a teenager and emerged from the war in a state that was trying to rebuild while still deeply divided. His later criminal career made him famous, but the conditions that produced Jesse James were shaped by the conflict that came before it, which is why his story says as much about Missouri's Civil War experience as it does about crime in the American West. By the end of the 19th century, Missouri was still a crossroads. The difference was that the things moving through the state had changed. People and goods still mattered. Information was becoming just as important. Fact 24. The people who map the world. 200 years ago, explorers left Missouri to help map a continent. Today, one of the world's most important mapping organizations operates from the same state. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, has a major presence in St. Louis. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Most people haven't. But the agency plays a critical role in everything from military operations to disaster response. Its job is to understand the world through geography. Satellites, maps, terrain, infrastructure, location data. In other words, the kinds of information that help people understand where things are and how they connect. And that's a surprisingly fitting role for Missouri. For more than 2 centuries, The state has sat at the intersection of transportation networks, migration routes, and regional identities. Today, it also sits at the intersection of information. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why does Missouri keep showing up? Fact 25. The same pattern 200 years later. Think about all the stories we've covered. On the surface, they don't seem to have much in common, but most of them trace back to the same basic reality. Missouri sits where important systems meet. That doesn't automatically make a place important. What it does create is opportunity. And for more than 2 centuries, Missouri has been unusually good at turning that opportunity into influence. Which is why the state keeps appearing in stories about exploration, migration, commerce, conflict, and innovation. Not because Missouri was the biggest state, or the richest, or fastest growing, but because it was often the place where different parts of America connected. Missouri's story isn't really about a single city, river, industry, or historical event. It's about connections between east and west, north and south, rivers and railroads, past and future. That's why Lewis and Clark left from here, why trails began here, why St. Louis grew here, and why conflict erupted here. And why, even today, organizations that specialize in understanding geography continue to invest here. Missouri didn't shape American history by standing apart from the rest of the country. It shaped American history by sitting in the middle of it.